In the quiet shadows of deep antiquity, where the desert meets the river and human ambition first learned to dream in stone, there emerged a place that would become synonymous with power itself. Picture, if you will, the fertile plains of Mesopotamia around 2300 BCE, where two great rivers carved life from an otherwise merciless landscape. The Tigris and Euphrates flowed like arteries through the ancient world, bringing not merely water, but the possibility of civilization between these twin rivers. On the banks of the Euphrates, a settlement began to take form. The Akkadians, those Semitic peoples who had learned to master irrigation and agriculture, chose this spot with the instinct of those who understand that geography is destiny. They called it Bab-elim in their tongue, which meant Gate of God. The Greeks would later know it as Babylon, and that name would echo through millennia, becoming a symbol of both magnificence and moral warning, of human achievement and human hubris. The location was no accident. Babylon stood at the crossroads of ancient trade routes, where caravans from the Persian Gulf met those descending from Anatolia, where the products of the East mingled with the goods of the West. The Euphrates itself was a highway of commerce, its waters carrying boats laden with grain, textiles, and precious metals. Yet more than geography shaped this city's destiny. The land between the rivers was not merely fertile, but demanded cooperation, required organization, necessitated law. The flooding of the rivers came with seasonal regularity, but controlling these floods, channeling them into irrigation systems, storing grain against lean years, these tasks required something beyond individual effort. Here, in this challenging environment, humanity learned to build not just homes, but societies, not just farms, but economies, not just villages, but cities. The mud of the Euphrates became brick, and brick became walls, and walls became temples that reached toward the sky. The very earth that farmers tilled in spring would be transformed into the ziggurats that defined the Mesopotamian skyline in those early days. Babylon was hardly the colossus it would become. It existed as one settlement among many in a landscape dotted with city-states, each with its own patron deity, its own ambitions, its own dreams of dominance. Ur, Uruk, Kish, Lagish, these names commanded more respect, controlled more territory, wielded more influence. Babylon was younger, smaller, less significant in the grand theater of Mesopotamian politics. Yet even in obscurity, something stirred. The city's position, its access to water and trade, its growing population of artisans and merchants, these advantages accumulated slowly, like interest in an ancient ledger. The priests of Marduk, Babylon's patron god, tended their temples and told stories of their deity's greatness, planting seeds of an ideology that would one day justify empire. Time, as it often does, was working in Babylon's favor, preparing the stage for a destiny that would transform this modest settlement into the beating heart of the ancient world. The world that gave birth to Babylon was already ancient when Babylon's first bricks were laid. For more than 1,000 years before our city emerged, the lands of Mesopotamia had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations that had invented the very concept of urban life. The Sumerians, those mysterious people whose origins remain debated to this day, had built the first cities humanity had ever known in places like Uruk and Ur. The Sumerians had pioneered achievements that would define civilized existence itself. They created cuneiform, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay to record not merely accounting figures, but literature, law, and theology. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that timeless meditation on friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning, was first written in Sumerian cuneiform. They built massive temple complexes called ziggurats, artificial mountains where heaven and earth could meet, where gods could descend and humans could ascend. The Sumerians organized their cities as theocracies, where priests interpreted divine will and managed vast temple economies. They developed sophisticated mathematics, including a base 60 number system that still influences how we measure time and angles today. They brewed beer, composed hymns, studied the movements of celestial bodies, and created legal codes that would influence every civilization that followed. Yet the Sumerians, for all their brilliance, were not destined to dominate forever. Around 2334 BC, Sargon of Akkad, a Semitic ruler of mysterious origin, conquered the Sumerian city-states and created history's first true empire. The Akkadian language, a Semitic tongue related to Hebrew and Arabic, began to spread alongside Sumerian, creating a bilingual culture of remarkable sophistication. This Akkadian civilization provided the direct cultural foundation for Babylon. When Babylon eventually rose to prominence, it would speak Akkadian, worship gods with Akkadian names grafted onto Sumerian deities, and see itself as the rightful heir to both Sumerian wisdom and Akkadian power. The city inherited a rich theological tradition in which gods were organized into hierarchies, where cosmic order was maintained through ritual, where kings ruled as representatives of divine authority. Babylon also inherited the Mesopotamian worldview, one that saw the universe as fundamentally orderly but requiring constant maintenance through proper religious observance. The cosmos was not random, but governed by divine laws, and earthly laws should mirror these celestial principles. This belief would profoundly influence Babylonian legal and political thought. The writing system, too, came as an inheritance. Cuneiform script, with its hundreds of signs, required years of training to master, creating a class of scribes who became essential to administration, commerce, and religious life. These scribes would staff Babylon's bureaucracy, record its treaties, compose its literature, and preserve its history. Mesopotamian mathematics and astronomy provided tools for predicting floods, calculating taxes, surveying land, and reading omens in the sky. The religious calendar, with its festivals and rituals, structured the year and legitimized royal authority. All these elements, linguistic, religious, scientific, administrative, formed the cultural DNA that Babylon would inherit and eventually transform into something uniquely its own, something that would outlast all its predecessors and define civilization for the ancient world. There is something deeply moving about obscurity, about the long centuries when greatness gestates in silence, when future glory exists only as potential, unrealized and unrecognized. Early Babylon lived through such centuries, appearing in ancient records as little more than a name, a minor administrative center, a place of modest importance in the shadow of more powerful neighbors. The first certain mention of Babylon dates to around 2300 BCE, during the Akkadian Empire of Sargon. In these early references, the city appears as a provincial town, notable primarily for its temple to Marduk, a deity who had not yet achieved the supreme status he would later enjoy. Archaeological evidence suggests a settlement even older, perhaps dating back to the early dynastic period. But these earliest layers remain fragmentary, disturbed by later building projects that would eventually cover Babylon's humble origins with magnificent structures. Under the Akkadian Empire and its successors, Babylon served as a regional administrative center, collecting taxes, storing grain, and maintaining order in its district. The city's governors answered to more powerful kings, ruling from more important capitals. When the Akkadian Empire collapsed around 2154 BCE, thrown into chaos by internal rebellions and external invasions, Babylon survived as countless other cities did, by adapting, by accepting new masters, by preserving what it could of civilized life amid the turbulence. the third dynasty of Ur, that remarkable Sumerian revival that emerged around 2112 BCE, incorporated Babylon into its bureaucratic empire. Under Ur's meticulous administration, which left behind thousands of economic tablets documenting everything from sheep counts to beer rations, Babylon appears in records as a city of moderate size. Its population engaged in agriculture, craft production, and local trade, yet beneath this apparent mediocrity, foundations were being laid. The Temple of Marduk, though modest by later standards, was growing in prestige. Priests studied ancient texts, copied them, preserved them, slowly building a library of knowledge. Merchants established networks that would prove valuable in centuries to come. Artisans refined their crafts, passing skills from master to apprentice. The city's walls were maintained, its irrigation canals dredged. Its streets kept navigable docked when the third dynasty of Ur collapsed around 2004 BCE. Destroyed by Elamite invaders and internal decay, Mesopotamia fragmented into competing city-states. This fragmentation created opportunity. In the chaos, new dynasties emerged, and Babylon, no longer overshadowed by Ur's bureaucratic might, began to assert itself. Around 1894 BCE, an Amorite dynasty seized control of the city, establishing what historians call the first dynasty of Babylon. These Amorite rulers were Semitic peoples from the west who had been gradually infiltrating Mesopotamia for generations. They brought fresh energy, new perspectives, but also respect for the ancient traditions they found in Babylon. They patronized the Temple of Marduk, adopted Akkadian as their official language, and presented themselves as legitimate heirs to Mesopotamian kingship. For nearly 2 centuries, Babylon remained one power among many, contending with rival cities like Izin, Larsa, and Ishnana. Then, in 1792 BCE, a young king named Hammurabi ascended the throne, and everything changed. In the quiet corridors of history, certain individuals emerge who possess that rare combination of patience and ruthlessness, vision and pragmatism that transforms the possible into the inevitable. Hammurabi was such a man. When he ascended to Babylon's throne in 1792 BCE, he inherited a city-state of modest dimensions, surrounded by rivals of equal or greater power. When he died 43 years later, Babylon stood as the uncontested master of all Mesopotamia. The young king understood something fundamental about power in the ancient world. It was not won through reckless aggression, but through careful preparation, strategic alliances, and the ability to strike when the moment ripened. For the first decades of his reign, Hammurabi played the role of a cautious, pious ruler. He strengthened Babylon's walls, improved its irrigation systems, patronized its temples, and waited. He cultivated alliances with neighboring kings, sending gifts, arranging marriages, writing letters filled with diplomatic courtesy. Meanwhile, the greater powers of Mesopotamia exhausted themselves in endless conflicts. Larsa fought Elam. Ishnana clashed with Mari. The northern city of Assyria struggled to maintain its independence. Hammurabi watched these conflicts like a merchant calculating profit and loss, learning the strengths and weaknesses of each rival, waiting for the perfect moment to transform from observer to actor. That moment came. Around 1764 BCE, Rin-Sin of Larsa, who had ruled for 60 years and seemed invincible, had grown old and complacent. Hammurabi struck with devastating efficiency, conquering Larsa and absorbing its territories. The southern cities of Sumer, which had resisted Babylon for generations, suddenly found themselves under Hammurabi's control. The ancient cities of Ur and Uruk, cradles of civilization itself, now answered to Babylon, But Hammurabi was far from finished. He turned his attention northward, against his former ally Zimri-Lim of Mari. The two kings had exchanged friendly letters for years. But friendship in ancient diplomacy meant nothing when set against ambition. In 1761 BCE, Hammurabi's armies destroyed Mari, that magnificent city on the Euphrates with its vast palace and extensive archives. The city was so thoroughly demolished that it would never rise again, its ruins waiting 4,000 years until archaeologists uncovered its splendors. Eshnunna fell next, then the territories along the Tigris. Within a decade of explosive military action, Hammurabi had transformed Babylon from a regional power into an empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Assyria. It was a stunning achievement, made more remarkable by the fact that Hammurabi accomplished it while already in his 50s, an age when most ancient rulers were content to consolidate rather than conquer. Yet Hammurabi understood that empires built on conquest alone do not endure. Military victory had given him an empire, but only effective administration could keep it. He personally supervised his vast domains, reading reports from governors, settling disputes, ensuring that irrigation systems functioned properly, and that justice was administered fairly. His letters, preserved on clay tablets, reveal a ruler obsessed with details, concerned with everything from the construction of canals to the prosecution of corrupt officials. The king also grasped the power of ideology. He elevated Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, to supremacy over all other Mesopotamian gods, creating a theological justification for Babylon's political dominance. If Marduk was king of the gods, then surely his city deserved to rule all others. This religious reformation would have consequences far beyond Hammurabi's lifetime, establishing Babylon as not merely a political capital, but a sacred center whose very existence seemed ordained by divine will. Among all of Hammurabi's achievements, one would outlast his empire, his dynasty, and even Babylon itself. Near the end of his reign, the king commanded that a comprehensive legal code be inscribed on a massive stele of black diorite stone, nearly 8 feet tall. At its top, a carved relief showed Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and deity of justice. Below, in beautiful cuneiform script, ran 282 laws covering virtually every aspect of Babylonian life. This was not humanity's first law code. The Sumerians had created legal collections centuries earlier, but Hammurabi's code represented something different in both scope and ambition. These were not merely local customs or royal decrees, but a systematic attempt to create a unified legal framework for an entire empire. The code addressed crimes and punishments, property rights and family law, commercial regulations and professional standards. It covered conflicts between social classes, set wages for various occupations, established liability for medical malpractice and building collapses, and regulated everything from divorce to irrigation disputes. The most famous principle within the code was the law of retaliation. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. If he break another man's bone, his bone shall be broken. This concept, often reduced to the phrase an eye for an eye, has been misunderstood as primitive vengeance. In reality, it represented a revolutionary attempt to limit retribution, to ensure that punishment matched the crime, rather than spiraling into blood feuds that could destroy families and communities. Yet the code also revealed the deep inequalities of Babylonian society. Punishments varied dramatically based on social status. If a noble struck another noble, he paid a fine. If he struck a commoner, the fine was less. If he struck a slave, the penalty was minimal. The code protected property rights vigorously, but treated slaves as property rather than persons. Women had certain protections rights to divorce, inheritance, and business ownership, but remained under male authority in most circumstances. What made Hammurabi's code truly revolutionary was not its content, much of which codified existing customs, but its public nature and imperial scope. The stele was erected in Babylon's main square, where anyone who could read or could hire a scribe to read could learn what the law required. Copies were sent throughout the empire, establishing uniform legal standards from the Persian Gulf to northern Mesopotamia. For the first time, a ruler explicitly claimed that law should be public, knowable, and consistent. The code's prologue revealed Hammurabi's self-understanding. He described himself as the shepherd, chosen by the gods to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and evil, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. Whether this represented genuine conviction or sophisticated propaganda hardly matters. What matters is that Hammurabi articulated an ideal of kingship based not merely on military prowess, but on justice and protection of the vulnerable. This ideal would influence every civilization that followed. When Persian kings, Greek philosophers, Roman jurists, and medieval scholars thought about law and justice, they did so in categories that Hammurabi had helped establish. The principle that laws should be written, public, and equally applicable became foundational to Western legal thought. Even as the specific content of those laws evolved beyond recognition, the great stele itself traveled through history like a witness to changing empires. When Elamites conquered Babylon centuries after Hammurabi's death, they carried the stele to Susa as a trophy. There it remained for millennia until French archaeologists discovered it in 1901, remarkably intact. Today it stands in the Louvre, its ancient laws still legible, Hammurabi still receiving justice from Shamash, a monument to humanity's eternal struggle to replace chaos with order. As one chapter closed with Hammurabi's death in 1750 BCE, another opened that would demonstrate an essential truth about great cities. They transcend their founders. Hammurabi's empire did not long survive him intact within a century. Much of his territorial conquests had been lost, yet Babylon itself entered a golden age that would establish it as the cultural and intellectual center of the ancient Near East under Hammurabi's successors. Babylon transformed from a military power into something more enduring, a center of learning, commerce, and cultural achievement. The city's population swelled as merchants, artisans, scribes, and priests from across Mesopotamia recognized that Babylon offered opportunities unavailable elsewhere. The great Temple of Marduk became not merely a religious center, but an economic powerhouse, controlling vast lands, employing thousands, and functioning as a bank. It financed commercial ventures throughout the region. The scribal schools of Babylon achieved particular distinction. Here, in the Edaba or tablet houses, young students spent years mastering the complex cuneiform script, copying ancient texts, and learning the mathematical and astronomical knowledge accumulated over millennia. These schools preserved and transmitted the intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia, ensuring that Sumerian literature, mathematical techniques, and astronomical observations would not be lost. The curriculum was demanding students learn not only Akkadian, but also Sumerian, the ancient language that had become for Babylonians what Latin would be for medieval Europe. A dead language kept alive by scholarship. Babylonian mathematics reached heights that would not be surpassed for centuries. Scribes developed sophisticated algebraic techniques, solved complex equations, calculated the areas of irregular fields, and understood principles of geometry that anticipated later Greek achievements. They created mathematical tables, multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, tables of squares and cubes that made complex calculations more efficient. These mathematical advances were not merely theoretical, but served practical purposes: surveying land, calculating taxes, determining interest on loans, and designing monumental architecture. Astronomy became another field where Babylon excelled beyond all rivals. Babylonian priests observed the heavens with meticulous care, recording the movements of planets, tracking lunar cycles, and predicting eclipses. Their observations, accumulated over centuries, would eventually enable them to predict astronomical phenomena with remarkable accuracy. This astronomical work was inseparable from astrology. The priests believed that celestial events influenced earthly affairs, but the quality of their observations meant that even their errors were productive, creating a foundation of data that later astronomers could use. The city itself became a wonder of architecture and urban planning. Hammurabi and his successors expanded and beautified Babylon, constructing new temples, strengthening fortifications, and improving the infrastructure that made urban life possible. The Euphrates flowed through the city's heart, crossed by bridges and lined with quays, where boats loaded and unloaded goods from across the known world. Markets bustled with activity as traders from Anatolia, Persia, and Arabia exchanged goods and ideas. Yet beneath this prosperity, weaknesses accumulated. The dynasty that Hammurabi founded faced increasing pressure from new peoples entering Mesopotamia. The Kassites, Indo-European peoples from the Zagros Mountains, gradually infiltrated Babylonian territories, first as mercenaries and laborers, then as an increasingly powerful political force. In 1595 BCE, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. Hittite raiders from distant Anatolia swept down the Euphrates, sacked Babylon, and departed with immense plunder, leaving chaos in their wake. The Kassites seized this moment, establishing a dynasty that would rule Babylon for over 4 centuries. Yet remarkably, these foreign conquerors chose not to destroy Babylonian culture, but to embrace it, adopting the Akkadian language, worshiping Babylonian gods, and presenting themselves as legitimate heirs to Hammurabi's legacy. Babylon's golden age dimmed, but did not end, its cultural influence so powerful that even its conquerors became its students. There are periods in the lives of cities, as in the lives of individuals, when greatness seems a distant memory, when former glory exists only in stories told by priests and preserved in crumbling tablets. Babylon entered such a period after the Hittite raid of 1595 BCE, beginning centuries when the city endured rather than dominated, when it preserved its identity under foreign masters, while waiting for destiny to turn once more in its favor. The Kassites, those mysterious peoples from the mountains of western Iran, established themselves as Babylon's new rulers and would maintain their dynasty for an astonishing 400 years. This longevity itself speaks to something remarkable about their rule. They succeeded not through constant military campaigns, but through administrative competence and cultural adaptation. The Kassite kings took Babylonian names, worshipped at Marduk's temple, commissioned inscriptions in Akkadian, and presented themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as legitimate heirs to the throne that Hammurabi had made glorious. Yet for all their efforts at legitimacy, Babylon under the Kassites never recovered the imperial dominance it had enjoyed under Hammurabi. The city remained important, a major center of trade, learning, and religion, but it was no longer the unquestioned master of Mesopotamia. To the north, the kingdom of Assyria grew increasingly powerful, its warrior kings building an empire through relentless military expansion. To the east, Elam remained a constant threat, launching periodic raids into Babylonian territory. To the south, the ancient Sumerian cities maintained a degree of independence. Acknowledging Babylon's prestige while resisting its political control, the Kassite period saw Babylon's influence become more cultural than political. The city's scribal schools continued to train scholars from across Mesopotamia. Its astronomical observations grew ever more sophisticated, creating records that would prove invaluable for understanding celestial patterns. The Temple of Marduk accumulated wealth through donations and land grants, becoming an economic institution of immense power even as Babylon's kings struggled to maintain military relevance. In this way, Babylon discovered a form of power more enduring than conquest, the power of culture, knowledge, and religious authority to command respect even from those who held military superiority. The end of Kassite rule came not from internal decay, but from external catastrophe. Around 1155 BCE, an Elamite king named Shutruk-Nakhonten invaded Babylonia with devastating force. His armies swept through the land, conquered city after city, and entered Babylon itself. The Elamites methodically looted the city's greatest treasures, carrying back to Susa not merely gold and silver, but the very symbols of Babylonian identity. They took Hammurabi's law code stele, ancient victory monuments, and most shocking of all, the statue of Marduk himself from the god's sanctuary. This theft of Marduk's statue struck Babylon like a wound to its collective soul. In Mesopotamian theology, a god resided in his statue. To steal the statue was to kidnap the deity himself, to render the city abandoned by its divine protector. Babylon had survived foreign dynasties and military defeats, but this theological catastrophe shook the city's confidence in ways that political losses never could. How could Babylon claim to be Marduk's chosen city when Marduk himself had been carried away into captivity? The decades that followed saw Babylon at perhaps its lowest point. The city struggled under weak rulers who could barely maintain order within Babylonia itself, much less project power beyond its borders. Assyria, sensing weakness, began to intervene more aggressively in Babylonian affairs, sometimes supporting puppet rulers, sometimes ruling directly. The great city that had once dictated terms to all Mesopotamia now found itself subject to the whims of more powerful neighbors. Yet, something in Babylon refused to accept this diminished status. The priests of Marduk kept alive the memory of past greatness, copying ancient texts that told of Hammurabi's triumphs, maintaining temples that testified to divine favor, preserving an identity distinct from and superior to their Assyrian overlords. Babylonian scholars continued their astronomical observations, their mathematical calculations, their literary pursuits, creating a cultural legacy that would outlast all the empires that rose and fell around them. In the darkness of political subjugation, Babylon nurtured the flame of a civilization that knew itself to be eternal, even when its present circumstances suggested otherwise. There is something eternal about the story of a people who refuse to forget their former greatness, who transform historical memory into political resistance, who see in their subjugation not a permanent condition, but a temporary aberration that must be corrected. Babylon, under the shadow of Assyrian power, became precisely such a people. The Assyrians, those warriors of northern Mesopotamia, had built the most feared military machine the ancient world had yet seen. Their armies moved with terrifying efficiency, equipped with iron weapons, siege engines, and cavalry that could overwhelm traditional defenses. Their kings boasted in monumental inscriptions of cities destroyed, populations deported, enemies flayed alive or impaled as warnings to others who might resist. Assyrian power rested on calculated brutality, and for centuries, this brutality worked. Yet Babylon presented the Assyrians with a unique problem. Other conquered cities could be destroyed, their populations scattered, their very names erased from history. But Babylon could not be treated like other conquests. The city held too much prestige, too much cultural authority, too much religious significance. Even Assyrian kings, who gloried in their own military prowess, acknowledged Babylon's special status. They claimed ancestry from Babylonian heroes, donated to Babylonian temples, and commissioned inscriptions in Babylonian script. To destroy Babylon would be to destroy the very cultural foundation that gave Assyrian kingship its legitimacy. This ambivalence created space for Babylonian resistance. Throughout the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Babylon repeatedly rebelled against Assyrian domination. These were not minor disturbances, but full-scale revolts that required massive Assyrian military campaigns to suppress. Chaldean tribal leaders from southern Babylonia emerged as champions of independence, rallying Babylonians with promises of restored glory and freedom from northern oppression. The most dramatic rebellion came in 689 BCE under a Chaldean leader named Marduk. For years he defied the Assyrian king Sennacherib, even as Assyrian armies ravaged Babylonian territories. The rebellion failed, as rebellions against Assyrian might generally did. But Sennacherib's response revealed the depth of his frustration. He ordered Babylon destroyed, not merely conquered, but annihilated. Assyrian soldiers systematically demolished the city's walls, temples, and palaces. They diverted water to flood the ruins, attempting to reduce Babylon to swampland. Most shockingly, they removed Marduk's statue from the temple, holding the god himself hostage in Assyria. This destruction should have ended Babylon's story. Yet within a decade, Sennacherib's son and successor, Esarhaddon, began rebuilding the city. The political calculation was clear. Assyria could not afford to permanently alienate the Babylonians, could not rule Mesopotamia without Babylon's cultural and religious cooperation. Esarhaddon restored temples, returned Marduk's statue, and crowned himself king of Babylon in an elaborate ceremony designed to demonstrate his respect for Babylonian traditions. But respect built on fear is fragile. When Esarhaddon died in 669 BCE, he divided his empire between his sons. Ashurbanipal received Assyria, while Shamash-shum-ukin became king of Babylon. This arrangement, intended to satisfy both Assyrian and Babylonian interests, instead created conditions for catastrophic conflict. Shamash-shum-ukin, though placed on Babylon's throne by his brother, came to identify with Babylonian aspirations for genuine independence. In 652 BCE, he rebelled, and for 4 years, brother fought brother in a civil war that devastated Mesopotamia. Ashurbanipal's forces eventually prevailed. Shamash-shum-ukin died in his burning palace, and Babylon once again submitted to Assyrian authority. Yet these repeated cycles of rebellion and suppression revealed an essential truth. Assyria possessed overwhelming military power, but could not break Babylon's spirit. Each destroyed temple was rebuilt. Each deported population eventually returned. Each humiliation became another grievance to fuel the next rebellion. The priests kept alive prophecies of a day when Babylon would rule and Assyria would fall, when Marduk would triumph over Ashur, when the natural order of things would be restored. These prophecies sustained hope through decades of subjugation. They transformed historical memory into revolutionary ideology, making every Babylonian a potential rebel, every priest a keeper of dangerous dreams. And as the 7th century BCE drew toward its close, as Assyrian power overextended itself through constant warfare, these dreams would find a champion capable of making them reality. Sometimes history pivots on the ambitions of a single individual who appears at precisely the moment when circumstances allow the impossible to become inevitable. Nabopolassar was such a man. Little is known of his origins. He appears to have been a Chaldean tribal leader from southern Babylonia, possibly a governor under Assyrian authority. What is certain is that in 626 BCE, as Assyrian power began to fracture under the weight of overextension and internal conflicts, Nabopolassar seized Babylon and declared himself king. The Assyrians responded as they always had, with overwhelming military force. Armies marched south to crush yet another Babylonian rebellion. Yet this time, something was different. Nabopolassar proved to be a commander of remarkable skill, combining guerrilla tactics with conventional warfare, knowing when to give battle and when to retreat into the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, where Assyrian chariots could not follow. More importantly, he understood that defeating Assyria required more than military skill. It required patience, diplomacy, and the ability to forge alliances with other peoples who chafed under Assyrian domination. To the east, in the Iranian plateau, the Medes were building their own kingdom and harbored their own grievances against Assyria. Nabopolassar reached out to Seoxerxes, the Median king, proposing an alliance that would benefit both peoples. The arrangement was sealed with a diplomatic marriage. Nabopolassar's son, the crown prince Nebuchadnezzar, would marry Amytis, daughter of Cyaxares. This marriage alliance created a coalition capable of challenging Assyrian supremacy. For more than a decade, Nabopolassar and Cyaxares coordinated their attacks, drawing Assyrian forces in multiple directions, never giving them time to concentrate overwhelming strength against a single enemy. Nabopolassar proved himself not merely a warrior, but a political genius, cultivating support among Babylonian cities that had grown weary of endless warfare, presenting himself not as a rebel, but as a liberator, restoring Babylon's rightful independence. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for centuries, began to crack under the pressure. Internal divisions weakened the central government. Provinces rebelled. Vassal states sensed opportunity and withheld tribute. The empire that had once seemed invincible revealed itself to be a structure held together primarily by fear. And when that fear diminished, the structure collapsed with stunning speed. In 614 BCE, the Medes captured and destroyed Ashur, the ancient capital and religious heart of Assyria. 2 years later, in 612 BCE, the combined forces of Babylon and Media besieged Nineveh, the magnificent capital where Assyrian kings had built palaces decorated with scenes of their conquests. For 3 months, Nineveh held out, its massive walls and desperate defenders buying time that would not come. Finally, the city fell. What happened next became legendary for its thoroughness. Nineveh was not merely conquered but obliterated, so completely destroyed that within a few generations its very location was forgotten, buried under dirt and sand until 19th century archaeologists rediscovered its ruins. The destruction of Nineveh sent shockwaves through the ancient world. The empire that had seemed eternal, whose kings had claimed to rule by divine mandate, whose armies had been invincible, simply ceased to exist. Nabopolassar had achieved what generations of Babylonian rebels had died attempting. He had broken Assyrian power forever and restored Babylonian independence. Yet Nabopolassar was not content merely with liberation. In the remaining years of his reign, he transformed Babylon from a subject city into an imperial capital. He rebuilt temples that Assyrian reprisals had damaged, restored walls, renovated palaces, and re-established Babylon's administrative apparatus. He secured Babylonia's borders and began to extend influence northward into territories that had been Assyrian. When he died in 605 BCE, after 21 years of rule, he left his son Nebuchadnezzar not merely an independent kingdom but an emerging empire with the potential to dominate the entire Near East.
The fall of Assyria represented more than the defeat of a single empire. It marked the end of an era in Near Eastern history and created a power vacuum that would reshape the geopolitical landscape of the ancient world. For centuries, Assyria had been the dominant force, the empire that other kingdoms feared, the standard against which military might was measured. Its collapse sent reverberations that reached from Egypt to Persia, from Anatolia to Arabia. The destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE did not immediately end Assyrian resistance. Remnants of the Assyrian army retreated westward to Haran, where they established a government in exile under a king named Ashur-uballit II. This last Assyrian king appealed desperately to Egypt for support, and the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II, recognizing that a Babylonian-dominated Mesopotamia threatened Egyptian interests, dispatched armies northward to prop up this Assyrian remnant. The resulting conflict drew in multiple powers. Nabopolassar, now aging and ill, sent his son Nebuchadnezzar to command Babylonian forces in Syria and against the Assyrian-Egyptian alliance. In 609 BCE, Haran fell to Babylonian and Median forces, and with it died the last pretense of Assyrian independence. Ashur-uballit II disappeared from history, his fate unknown, the last of a line of kings who had once made the world tremble. Egypt, however, was not ready to concede Near Eastern supremacy to Babylon. Pharaoh Necho II occupied Syria and Palestine, establishing a buffer zone between Egyptian power and the rising Babylonian threat. This Egyptian intervention would have profound consequences, not merely for the great empires but for a small kingdom caught in the crossfire. Judah, whose fate would become intertwined with Babylon's in ways that would echo through religious history for millennia. The geopolitical situation crystallized into a new configuration of power. The Median Empire controlled the Iranian plateau and much of eastern Anatolia. The Lydian kingdom held western Anatolia. Egypt dominated the Nile Valley and the Levant. And Babylon, newly liberated and rapidly strengthening, claimed Mesopotamia and harbored ambitions for much more. The old order, built on Assyrian supremacy, had given way to a multipolar world where no single power could dominate as completely as Assyria once had. Yet among these powers, Babylon held certain advantages. It commanded the agricultural wealth of Mesopotamia, the richest farmland in the Near East. It controlled crucial trade routes connecting the Persian Gulf with the Mediterranean. Most importantly, it possessed an ideological and cultural authority that mere military power could not provide. Babylon's prestige, built over millennia, gave its kings a legitimacy that newer powers lacked. When Babylonian kings spoke, they did so with the weight of Hammurabi's legacy, Marduk's favor, and a civilization that had been ancient when Egypt's pyramids were young. The fall of Assyria also freed Babylon from a psychological burden that had weighed on it for centuries. No longer did Babylonians need to see themselves as victims, as a great civilization temporarily subjugated by barbarous warriors from the north. They could reclaim their self-image as the natural leaders of Mesopotamia, the people chosen by the gods to bring order to the world. This restoration of pride, this recovery of historical mission, energized Babylonian society in ways that military victory alone could not. In 605 BCE, events came to a head. Nebuchadnezzar, commanding Babylonian forces in Syria, met the Egyptian army at Carchemish on the Euphrates. The battle that followed was decisive. Babylonian forces routed the Egyptians, pursuing them southward and destroying what remained of their military power in the region. Egypt's bid for Near Eastern dominance ended at Carchemish, and the way lay open for Babylon to extend its authority over Syria, Palestine, and the rich trading cities of the Levant. As Nebuchadnezzar celebrated this victory, word reached him that his father Nabopolassar had died in Babylon. The crown prince immediately rushed back to the capital, covering the 500 miles in remarkable time to secure his succession. He need not have worried. The transition was smooth, and when Nebuchadnezzar II formally ascended the throne, he inherited an empire at the height of its power and poised to achieve greatness that would surpass even the legendary days of Hammurabi. The stage was set for Babylon's greatest age, and history waited to see what this ambitious young king would build on the foundation his father had laid. There walks through time a figure whose name alone conjures images of absolute power, architectural magnificence, and an ambition so vast it seemed to challenge heaven itself. Nebuchadnezzar II ascended Babylon's throne in 605 BCE as a young man already proven in battle, already respected by the army that had followed him to victory at Carchemish. Yet military prowess, while necessary for building an empire, was only the beginning of what Nebuchadnezzar envisioned for Babylon. The new king inherited from his father an independent Babylon and a nascent empire, but he dreamed of something far greater, a city so magnificent that its very existence would testify to the supremacy of Babylonian civilization, a capital so splendid that visitors from distant lands would return home with stories that sounded like myths. Nebuchadnezzar possessed that rare combination of qualities found in history's greatest builders: unlimited ambition, vast resources, absolute authority, and the administrative genius to transform vision into stone and brick. From the earliest years of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar pursued a dual strategy of military expansion and monumental construction. His armies campaigned regularly in Syria and Palestine, suppressing rebellions, collecting tribute, and ensuring that the Levantine kingdoms understood their subordinate status. These campaigns provided the wealth, tribute, plunder, and taxes necessary to fund Nebuchadnezzar's building project. More importantly, they provided labor. Thousands of skilled craftsmen, artisans, and workers from conquered territories were brought to Babylon, not merely as slaves, but as contributors to projects that would immortalize the king's glory. Nebuchadnezzar's building obsession bordered on the megalomaniacal. He could not see an old temple without planning a more magnificent replacement, could not observe existing walls without imagining higher and stronger fortifications, could not walk through Babylon's streets without envisioning broader avenues and more impressive monuments. Ancient texts record that he rebuilt virtually every significant structure in Babylon, often demolishing perfectly functional buildings simply because they did not meet his standards of grandeur. The king's inscriptions, found on bricks throughout Babylon's ruins, reveal this obsession in his own words. On brick after brick appears the same formula: I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, provider for Esazela and Ezida, eldest son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. These inscriptions were not meant to be seen by human eyes. They were placed in foundations, within walls, in locations that would remain hidden unless the structure collapsed. They were messages to the gods and to future ages, testimony that Nebuchadnezzar had rebuilt Babylon in a manner worthy of Marduk's favor. Yet for all his building mania, Nebuchadnezzar was no mere construction enthusiast. He understood that architecture was politics made permanent, that magnificent buildings proclaimed power more effectively than armies, that cities designed to inspire awe could subjugate minds as surely as military force subjugated bodies. Every temple he built reinforced priestly authority and religious loyalty. Every palace proclaimed royal majesty. Every fortification demonstrated Babylon's impregnability. Every processional way, every gate, every ziggurat contributed to a comprehensive vision of Babylon as the center of the world, the dwelling place of gods, the eternal city chosen by destiny to rule. Nebuchadnezzar also proved himself an able administrator of the empire. His military campaigns had expanded. He divided his territories into provinces, each governed by officials responsible directly to the king. He maintained an efficient system of royal messengers who carried his commands throughout the empire and brought back reports on everything from harvest yields to potential rebellions. He personally supervised major projects, reading reports, making decisions, and ensuring that his vision was executed according to his specifications. The king's reign of 43 years provided the stability necessary for his grand projects to be completed. Unlike his father, who spent most of his reign at war, Nebuchadnezzar enjoyed long periods of peace during which construction could proceed without interruption. The city became one vast construction site, with thousands of workers laboring year after year to realize the king's architectural dreams. Babylon transformed from a city that had known centuries of subjugation and destruction into something unprecedented in the ancient world, a purpose-built imperial capital designed to manifest divine favor and earthly power in equal measure. Among all of Nebuchadnezzar's achievements, one captured the imagination of the ancient world so completely that it became legendary, counted among the 7 wonders of the world, despite the fact that later historians would debate whether it ever truly existed. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon represented something unprecedented, an attempt to create paradise itself, to make the desert bloom, to build a mountain covered with greenery in the flat plains of Mesopotamia. The story, as ancient writers tell it, begins with love and homesickness. Nebuchadnezzar's wife Amytis was a Median princess, daughter of Cyaxares, given in marriage to seal the alliance between Media and Babylon. She came from the mountainous regions of Media, where verdant hills rose toward snow-capped peaks, where streams ran cool and clear, where vegetation grew lush without the constant irrigation that Mesopotamian agriculture required. In the flat, hot plains of Babylon, despite all its magnificence, Amytis pined for the landscapes of her homeland. Nebuchadnezzar, moved by his wife's longing and determined to demonstrate that Babylonian engineering could overcome any natural limitation, commissioned the construction of an artificial mountain. The structure rose in terraces, each level supporting trees, shrubs, and flowers, creating the appearance of a green hill rising improbably from Babylon's urban landscape. Ancient descriptions speak of terraces reaching heights of 75 feet or more, with each level set back from the one below, creating the impression of a pyramid of vegetation. The engineering challenges were immense. Mesopotamia's climate meant that plants required constant watering, yet lifting water to the upper terraces demanded mechanisms unprecedented in their sophistication. Babylonian engineers, the same minds that had designed irrigation systems, built canals, and solved countless hydraulic problems, created a system of pumps and water wheels that drew water from the Euphrates and carried it to the highest levels. From there, it cascaded down through channels to water each terrace, creating the sound of running water that must have been magical in a city where water normally flowed sluggishly through irrigation canals. The gardens were not hanging in the sense of being suspended by cables or chains, as the name might suggest. The Greek word kremastos, used in ancient descriptions, meant overhanging or elevated, referring to the terraces that projected outward from the supporting structure, creating the impression that the gardens floated in the air. Trees and vines grew so abundantly that they draped over the edges of each terrace, their foliage concealing the architecture beneath and enhancing the illusion of a natural hillside rather than an artificial construction. Imagine walking through Babylon on a scorching summer day, when the sun beat down mercilessly and the brick walls radiated heat, when dust swirled through streets and the very air seemed to shimmer with temperature. Then, turning a corner, you would encounter this impossible vision, a mountain of green rising toward the sky, the sound of flowing water reaching your ears, the scent of flowers and foliage replacing the dust and heat. The psychological impact must have been profound, a demonstration that Babylonian power extended even over nature itself. that the king could create paradise wherever he chose. Yet here, history enters uncertain territory. No Babylonian text clearly describes the Hanging Gardens. Nebuchadnezzar's own inscriptions, so detailed about his other building projects, never mention them. The descriptions come from Greek and Roman writers who lived centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's death, recording stories they had heard from travelers who claimed to have seen this wonder. Some modern scholars suggest that the Hanging Gardens might have been located not in Babylon, but in Nineveh, confused in later accounts, or that they might have been a legendary embellishment of more modest royal gardens. Yet whether the Hanging Gardens existed exactly as described, or whether they represent an idealized memory of Babylonian horticultural achievements, hardly diminishes their significance. The story itself reveals what the ancient world believed about Babylon, that it was a place where human ambition and engineering skill could achieve the impossible, where kings commanded resources so vast they could create wonders purely to please a beloved wife, where the boundary between the achievable and the fantastic became blurred. The Hanging Gardens, real or legendary, symbolized Babylon at its zenith, powerful enough to reshape nature, wealthy enough to pursue beauty for its own sake, confident enough to build monuments that seemed to challenge the gods themselves. If the Hanging Gardens represented Babylon's aspiration toward beauty, the city's fortifications represented its determination to never again fall under foreign domination. Nebuchadnezzar transformed Babylon into the most heavily fortified city the ancient world had ever seen, surrounded by walls so massive that ancient writers struggled to describe them without resorting to numbers that seem almost mythical. The main defensive system consisted of multiple walls arranged in concentric rings. The outer wall, built of sun-dried brick, stretched for miles around the city's perimeter. Behind it stood the inner wall, constructed of fired brick and far more durable, thick enough that chariots could race along its top. Ancient sources claim these walls rose to heights of 200 feet or more, though modern archaeology suggests more modest but still impressive dimensions of perhaps 80 to 100 feet. The walls were punctuated by towers at regular intervals, providing defensive positions and allowing for coordinated responses to any attack. The most spectacular entrance to Babylon was the Ishtar Gate, dedicated to the goddess of love and war. This gate alone represented an architectural achievement that would have made any other city proud. The structure stood perhaps 50 feet high, its surfaces covered with brilliant blue glazed bricks that would have gleamed in the Mesopotamian sun. Against this blue background, Babylonian craftsmen had created reliefs of bulls and dragons, the bull representing Adad, the storm god, and the dragon representing Marduk himself. These animals were formed from bricks of contrasting colors, creating images that seemed to stride across the gate's surface, guardians protecting the city from any who might threaten it. Passing through the Ishtar Gate, visitors entered the processional way, a broad avenue lined with walls decorated with 120 lions, symbols of Ishtar. This was not merely a street but a ceremonial path used during the New Year festival, when statues of the gods were carried in solemn procession from Babylon's temples to the Akitu house outside the city. The processional way was paved with stone, a luxury in Mesopotamia where stone was scarce and had to be imported from distant mountains. Each paving stone bore an inscription declaring that it had been laid by Nebuchadnezzar for Marduk's procession, transforming even the street itself into a religious statement. The processional way led to the heart of Babylon, where stood the ziggurat called Etemenanki, the foundation of heaven and earth. This massive stepped pyramid served as the earthly dwelling place of Marduk and the focal point of Babylonian religious life. Ancient descriptions suggest it rose in 7 stages to a height of perhaps 300 feet, though again, archaeology suggests more modest dimensions. At its summit stood a temple where priests performed rituals essential to maintaining cosmic order, where the king underwent ceremonies that confirmed his right to rule, where heaven and earth were believed to meet. The ziggurat's biblical fame as the Tower of Babel has obscured its actual religious function. This was not an act of hubris meant to reach heaven, but a carefully designed sacred architecture that reflected Mesopotamian theology. The ziggurat allowed the god to descend from heaven to earth, provided a meeting place between divine and human realms, and symbolized the mountain on which, according to Mesopotamian myth, the gods had created the world. Its 7 stages corresponded to the 7 planetary deities. Its colors symbolized different cosmic realms. Its proportions reflected sacred mathematical relationships. Near the ziggurat stood Esagila, Marduk's main temple complex, a vast sacred precinct containing not merely the god's sanctuary but treasuries, administrative offices, libraries, and residences for the priestly hierarchy. The temple owned vast estates throughout Babylonia, controlled significant commercial enterprises, and functioned as a bank that financed trade expeditions and agricultural ventures. Esagila was not merely a religious institution, but an economic powerhouse whose wealth helped sustain Babylon's magnificence. Nebuchadnezzar also built palaces of unprecedented scale. His southern palace covered several acres, its throne room decorated with glazed brick friezes showing processions of attendants and symbolic animals. The palace complex included not merely staterooms but extensive residential quarters, administrative offices, storage facilities, and according to some interpretations, the foundation structures that might have supported the hanging gardens. The king's inscriptions boast that he completed the southern palace in 15 days, clearly an exaggeration, but one that reveals Nebuchadnezzar's eagerness to emphasize the speed and efficiency of his building program. All these structures, walls, gates, processional ways, ziggurats, temples, palaces, combined to create a city unlike any other in the ancient world. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was not merely large, but designed, not merely functional, but symbolic, not merely powerful, but sacred. Every element served multiple purposes: defensive, administrative, religious, and propagandistic. A visitor approaching Babylon would see massive walls proclaiming impregnability, would pass through gates decorated with divine guardians, would walk streets designed for religious processions, and would glimpse rising above everything the ziggurat that connected earth to heaven. The message was unmistakable. This was the city of the gods, the eternal capital, the center of the world. As the walls of Babylon rose higher and the city's magnificence increased, so too did Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns extend Babylonian power across the Near East. The king was not content to rule merely Mesopotamia. He envisioned an empire that would control the vital trade routes connecting east and west, north and south, an empire whose boundaries would reach from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia. The Levant, the coastal regions of modern Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Israel became the primary theater of Nebuchadnezzar's imperial ambitions. These territories, strategically positioned between Mesopotamia and Egypt, had long been contested by greater powers. The small kingdoms of this region, Tyre, Sidon, Damascus, Jerusalem, and others, attempted to preserve their independence by playing larger empires against each other, by rebelling when imperial attention was directed elsewhere, by forming alliances that might deter aggression. Nebuchadnezzar systematically reduced these kingdoms to submission. His armies campaigned almost annually in the Levant, besieging cities that resisted, installing puppet rulers in place of rebellious kings, deporting populations that seemed unreliable. These deportations were not random cruelty but calculated policy. By removing skilled artisans, political leaders, and potential rebels from conquered territories and resettling them in Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar simultaneously weakened resistance in the provinces and strengthened Babylon itself with new talent and labor. The kingdom of Judah became caught in this imperial vice. When Nebuchadnezzar first campaigned in the Levant, Judah's king Jehoiakim accepted Babylonian overlordship and paid tribute. But Egyptian influence and nationalist sentiment led Jehoiakim to rebel. Nebuchadnezzar responded with overwhelming force. In 597 BCE, Babylonian armies besieged Jerusalem. The city surrendered, and Nebuchadnezzar deported the king, the nobility, the priests, and skilled craftsmen to Babylon, perhaps 10,000 people in total. He installed a new puppet king, Zedekiah, and assumed the matter was settled. Yet within a decade, influenced by Egyptian promises of support and prophets who insisted that God would protect Jerusalem, Zedekiah rebelled. This second rebellion exhausted Nebuchadnezzar's patience. In 586 BCE, Babylonian armies returned and besieged Jerusalem for 18 months. The siege was brutal, with famine reducing the population to desperate measures. When the walls were finally breached, Zedekiah attempted to flee but was captured. Nebuchadnezzar's judgment was harsh. Zedekiah's sons were executed before his eyes, then Zedekiah himself was blinded and taken in chains to Babylon. The city was systematically destroyed, walls demolished, houses burned, and most devastatingly, Solomon's temple, the sacred center of Jewish religious life, was razed to the ground. The destruction of Jerusalem and the subsequent Babylonian captivity would have consequences far beyond the immediate political situation. The experience of exile, of living in Babylon while remembering Jerusalem, of maintaining identity without temple or homeland, profoundly shaped Jewish theology and identity. Much of the Hebrew Bible was composed or compiled during this period, as Jewish scribes and priests worked to preserve their traditions and make sense of catastrophe. The experience of Babylonian exile became central to Jewish historical memory, shaping religious thought in ways that would influence not only Judaism, but Christianity and Islam as well. Nebuchadnezzar's other campaigns were equally successful. The wealthy Phoenician city of Tyre, built on an island and protected by naval power, resisted Babylonian siege for 13 years before finally accepting a compromise that acknowledged Babylonian supremacy while preserving some autonomy. Egypt, though unconquered, recognized Babylonian dominance in the Levant and ceased interfering in the region. Arabian tribes submitted to Babylonian authority or faced punitive expeditions that destroyed their settlements and disrupted trade routes. By the later years of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar ruled an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, that controlled the richest agricultural lands of Mesopotamia, the most important trade routes of the Near East, and the wealth of dozens of subject peoples. Tribute flowed into Babylon from territories that had once been independent kingdoms. The city's markets bustled with goods from across the known world, precious metals from Anatolia, cedar from Lebanon, spices from Arabia, textiles from Syria, grain from Egypt. Babylon had become what Nebuchadnezzar intended, the undisputed master of the known world, the greatest city in existence, the eternal capital whose magnificence testified to both divine favor and human genius. In the annals of history, few moments shine as bright as those marking the transition from triumph to tragedy, when the mighty discover that power cannot protect against the vulnerabilities of the human mind. Nebuchadnezzar's final years remain shrouded in mystery and legend, but the accounts that have survived suggest a descent into madness that transformed the greatest king of his age into something barely recognizable as human. The Book of Daniel, compiled by Jewish scribes during the Babylonian exile, preserves the most dramatic account of Nebuchadnezzar's affliction. According to this narrative, at the height of his power, while walking on the roof of his royal palace and surveying the magnificent city he had built, Nebuchadnezzar uttered words of supreme hubris. "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" Immediately, according to the biblical account, a voice from heaven pronounced judgment. The king would lose his reason and live like a beast of the field until he acknowledged that the Most High ruled over human kingdoms. What followed was 7 years of madness. Nebuchadnezzar was driven from human society, living outdoors, eating grass like an ox, his hair growing long and matted like eagle's feathers, his nails becoming like birds' claws. Only after this period of humiliation, when the king finally acknowledged divine sovereignty over earthly power, was his reason restored and his kingdom returned to him. Modern scholars debate the historical accuracy of this account. Some suggest it might represent a conflation of different traditions or a theological narrative designed to humble Babylonian power in Jewish memory. Others point to possible medical explanations, perhaps a form of psychosis or a condition called boanthropy, where individuals believe themselves to be animals. Still others suggest the story might have been transferred from a later king, possibly Nabonidus, whose eccentric behavior created similar legend. Yet Babylonian sources hint that something significant occurred late in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Administrative texts from this period become scarce, suggesting disruption in the normal functioning of government. Inscriptions from the king's final years are less frequent than those from earlier in his reign. The historical record thins, as if something had interrupted the documented flow of royal activity that had characterized decades of intensive building and military campaigning. Whether the affliction was literal madness, serious illness, or political crisis disguised as divine punishment, Nebuchadnezzar's final years marked a dramatic change from the confident, ambitious king who had dominated the first 4 decades of his reign. The man who had built the most magnificent city in the world, who had conquered kingdoms and deported nations, who had transformed Babylon into an imperial capital of unprecedented splendor, ended his days diminished, his mortality exposed, his human limitations revealed despite all his power. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE after 43 years on the throne, he left behind architectural achievements that would amaze visitors for centuries and an empire that stretched across the Near East. Yet he also left a troubling question. If the greatest king could fall so far, if madness could strike even the mighty, what did this suggest about the stability of the empire itself? The answer would come with devastating speed in the chaotic years that followed his death. Nebuchadnezzar's son Amel-Marduk ascended the throne, but ancient sources preserve little information about his reign beyond the suggestion that he attempted to reverse some of his father's policies. The Jewish king Jehoiakim, who had lived as a royal prisoner in Babylon for 37 years, was released from confinement and given honor at the Babylonian court. This act of clemency might have been genuine mercy or political calculation, an attempt to secure loyalty from the exiled Jewish community. Regardless, Amel-Marduk's reign lasted only 2 years before he was murdered in a palace conspiracy in 560 BCE. The conspirators placed Neriglissar, who had married one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, on the throne. This king ruled for 4 years, conducting some military campaigns but leaving little mark on history beyond the completion of certain building projects that Nebuchadnezzar had begun. When Neriglissar died in 556 BCE, possibly of natural causes, though ancient sources are unclear, the throne passed briefly to his son Labashimarduk, a child or adolescent who ruled for mere months before being overthrown and likely murdered. In less than 7 years following Nebuchadnezzar's death, Babylon had witnessed 4 kings, 2 murders, and growing instability that must have alarmed both the Babylonian aristocracy and the empire's subject peoples. The rapid turnover suggested deep divisions within the ruling class, competing factions struggling for power, and the absence of a strong leader capable of commanding the loyalty that Nebuchadnezzar had enjoyed. The empire that Nebuchadnezzar had built through decades of military campaigns and administrative competence was beginning to crack, its stability revealed as dependent on the personal authority of a single, exceptional ruler, rather than on institutional structures that could survive his passing. As one chapter closed with the palace conspiracies and murdered kings, another opened that would prove even stranger and more destabilizing. In 556 BCE, a man named Nabonidus seized power in Babylon under circumstances that remain disputed. He was not of royal blood, though he claimed descent from ancient Assyrian nobility. His mother had been a high priestess of the moon god Sin, and Nabonidus himself was deeply devoted to this deity, a devotion that would prove catastrophic for his reign. Nabonidus represented something unprecedented in Babylonian kingship, a ruler more interested in archaeology and religious antiquarianism than in the practical matters of governing an empire. He obsessively restored ancient temples, not merely to honor the gods, but to uncover the original foundation inscriptions left by kings who had ruled 1,000 years before his time. He excavated ruins, studied ancient texts, and sought to restore worship practices that had been abandoned for centuries. In another time, in another context, Nabonidus might have been celebrated as a scholar king. In the Babylon of the mid-6th century BCE, with enemies gathering on the borders and internal stability fragile, his interests proved disastrous. Most troublingly, Nabonidus elevated the moon god Sin to supremacy over Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. This was not merely a theological adjustment, but a direct challenge to the ideological foundation that had justified Babylon's political supremacy for centuries. If Marduk was not supreme among gods, why should his city be supreme among cities? The priests of Marduk's temple, the Esagila, recognized the threat immediately. Nabonidus's religious innovations undermined their authority, their wealth, and their political influence. The tension between king and priesthood escalated until Nabonidus made a decision that shocked his contemporaries. He abandoned Babylon. Around 553 BCE, the king departed for Tama, an oasis city in the Arabian desert, and remained there for 10 years. His reasons remain debated. Some ancient sources suggest religious motivations. Perhaps Tama housed an important shrine to Sin, or perhaps Nabonidus sought to establish a new religious center away from Babylon's hostile priesthood. Others propose political or economic explanations, control of Arabian trade routes, or retreat from a capital where he faced constant opposition. Whatever his motivations, Nabonidus's absence created a power vacuum in Babylon. He left his son Belshazzar as regent, empowered to govern in the king's absence, but lacking the full authority of kingship. This arrangement satisfied no one. The priests of Marduk resented being ruled by a proxy for a king who had insulted their god. The nobility found the situation irregular and demeaning. The common people of Babylon, deprived of a resident king who could perform the essential religious rituals that ensured divine favor, grew anxious about the city's fate. Meanwhile, forces beyond Babylon's borders were shifting in ways that would prove fatal to the empire. To the east, in the mountainous region of Persis, a remarkable leader named Cyrus had united the Persian and Median peoples under his rule. In 550 BCE, Cyrus overthrew his Median overlord and established what would become the Persian Empire. Unlike the petty kingdoms that had long dotted the Near East, Cyrus commanded vast resources, skilled armies, and an ideology of enlightened conquest that promised subject peoples better treatment than they had received from previous conquerors. Cyrus's expansion initially targeted territories far from Babylonia, Lydia in Anatolia, the Greek cities along the coast, the mountain peoples of the east. But each conquest added to Persian power, and intelligent observers in Babylon must have recognized that eventually Persia would turn its attention toward Mesopotamia, the empire that Nebuchadnezzar had built through military might. and that had been held together by the prestige of Babylonian civilization was now ruled by an absent king obsessed with archaeology and a regent who commanded neither full authority nor widespread respect. When Nabonidus finally returned to Babylon around 543 BCE, after a decade in the desert, he found a city deeply alienated from his rule. His attempted religious reforms had failed to gain acceptance. The priests of Marduk remained hostile. The population viewed him as eccentric at best, impious at worst. The king's inscriptions from this period reveal a defensive, almost paranoid tone, as he justified his actions and insisted that the gods supported him despite all evidence to the contrary. Nabonidus did attempt some conventional royal activities after his return. He led at least one military campaign and continued his building projects. But the damage to royal authority was profound. An empire requires more than armies and tribute. It requires legitimacy, the belief among both rulers and ruled that the current order is right and proper and blessed by divine favor. Nabonidus had squandered that legitimacy through his religious eccentricity, his decade-long absence, and his alienation of the very priesthood that could have validated his rule. As the 540s BCE progressed, news from the east grew increasingly ominous. Cyrus was conquering territory after territory, absorbing kingdoms that had seemed secure, demonstrating military prowess that recalled the great conquerors of earlier ages. The Persian Empire was becoming a superpower, and Babylon, weakened by internal dissension and ruled by a king who had lost the confidence of his people, stood directly in its path. There is something deeply moving about the final night of an empire, when those who have known only power and prosperity gather to celebrate, unaware that outside the walls destiny is already writing their epitaph. The Book of Daniel preserves what may be history's most famous description of such a night, Belshazzar's feast, the last celebration of Babylonian independence before darkness fell forever. The setting was Babylon in 539 BCE. Cyrus the Great's Persian armies were campaigning in Babylonia, conquering cities, accepting surrenders, and methodically dismantling the empire that Nebuchadnezzar had built. Nabonidus, the king who had spent 10 years in the Arabian desert, had returned to face the Persian threat, but had been defeated in battle and had fled, leaving Babylon under the authority of his son Belshazzar, the crown prince who had served as regent during his father's long absence. Babylon's massive walls, those fortifications that Nebuchadnezzar had built to make the city impregnable, seemed to offer security against even Persian might. The city had supplies to withstand a siege of years. The Euphrates provided water. Surely, the Babylonians reasoned, Cyrus would recognize the futility of besieging such a fortress and would offer terms that preserved at least nominal Babylonian independence. In this context of false confidence, Belshazzar held a great feast in the royal palace. According to the biblical account, he commanded that the golden and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the Jerusalem temple be brought forth so that he and his nobles could drink from them. This was more than simple use of captured treasure. It was a statement of supremacy, a demonstration that Babylon's gods had triumphed over the God of the Jews. That Babylonian power remained unshakable despite the Persian threat. As the feast progressed and wine flowed freely, something extraordinary occurred. Suddenly a hand appeared, detached from any body, writing mysterious words on the palace wall. The text that appeared consisted of 4 words in Aramaic: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. The feast halted. Belshazzar, terrified by this supernatural manifestation, called for his wise men, his astrologers, his magicians, all the learned men of Babylon who supposedly could interpret omens and divine the future. None could explain the writing's meaning. Finally, at the Queen Mother's suggestion, Daniel was summoned. This was the same Daniel who decades earlier had interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, who had survived in the lion's den, who represented the Jewish exiles living in Babylon. Daniel, standing before Belshazzar, first delivered a moral rebuke. Unlike Nebuchadnezzar, who had ultimately acknowledged divine sovereignty, Belshazzar had not humbled himself, but had instead exalted himself against the Lord of heaven by profaning the temple vessels. Then Daniel interpreted the writing. Mene meant numbered. God had numbered the days of Belshazzar's kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel meant weighed. Belshazzar had been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Perez, the singular form of uparsin, meant divided. The kingdom would be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. 3 words, each a death sentence for Babylonian independence. That very night, according to the biblical account, Belshazzar was killed and Babylon fell to Persian forces. The historical reality preserved in Babylonian and Persian records was both less dramatic and more complex than this narrative suggests, but no less consequential for Babylon's fate. Cyrus's conquest of Babylon was not achieved through direct assault on those magnificent walls, but through a stratagem of remarkable ingenuity. The Euphrates River flowed through Babylon, entering under the northern wall and exiting under the southern wall. Persian engineers diverted the river upstream, reducing its depth within the city to a level where soldiers could wade through. Under cover of darkness, Persian troops entered Babylon through the riverbed, penetrating the seemingly impregnable defenses through the water gates that the Babylonians had left unguarded, confident in their walls but neglectful of the river that had always sustained them. The conquest was remarkably bloodless. Whether through betrayal, incompetence, or simple paralysis in the face of the impossible, Babylon's defenses collapsed without significant resistance. Some ancient sources suggest that priests of Marduk, alienated by Nabonidus's religious policies, actively facilitated the Persian entry, viewing Cyrus as a liberator rather than a conqueror. Belshazzar was indeed killed during the city's fall, though the circumstances remain unclear, perhaps fighting, perhaps murdered by conspirators who hoped to gain Persian favor. The date was October 12, 539 BCE. On that night, Babylon's independence ended. The empire that Nabopolassar had liberated from Assyrian domination, that Nebuchadnezzar had expanded and glorified, that had seemed eternal as the city's massive walls, ceased to exist as a sovereign power. The city that had ruled Mesopotamia on and off for nearly 2 millennia, that had given the world Hammurabi's Code and the Hanging Gardens, that had deported the Jews and destroyed Solomon's temple, became a provincial capital in somebody else's empire. The writing on the wall had proven prophetic. Babylon had been numbered, weighed, and divided, and nothing, not magnificent walls, not ancient prestige, not divine favor, had been sufficient to prevent this fall. In the quiet shadows of history, where empires rise and fall like tides against an eternal shore, there exists a truth more powerful than any military conquest or political dominion. Some cities transcend their own mortality, living on not in brick and stone, but in the human imagination, in the laws we write, in the buildings we construct, in the very way we understand civilization itself. Babylon is such a city. When Cyrus the Great entered Babylon through the bed of the diverted Euphrates on that October night in 539 BCE, he demonstrated a wisdom that had eluded many conquerors before him. Rather than destroying the city that had resisted Persian expansion, rather than razing its temples and demolishing its walls as Assyrian kings had done to their enemies, Cyrus proclaimed himself the legitimate successor to Babylonian kingship. He presented his conquest not as foreign domination, but as liberation from Nabonidus's religious eccentricities. He restored proper worship at Marduk's temple, repatriated peoples whom the Babylonians had deported, including the Jews, whom he permitted to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, and preserved Babylon's administrative structures while incorporating them into his expanding Persian Empire. This policy of enlightened conquest allowed Babylon to continue as a great city even after losing political independence. Under Persian rule, Babylon remained one of the empire's most important centers, a cosmopolitan metropolis where peoples from across the known world mingled and traded. The city's schools continued to train scribes in cuneiform, its astronomers maintained their observations of celestial phenomena, its temples preserved ancient rituals and texts. Babylon under the Persians was no longer an imperial capital, but it retained the cultural prestige and economic vitality that had made it great. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in the 330s BCE, Babylon once again demonstrated its ability to captivate conquerors. The young Macedonian king was so impressed by the city that he planned to make it the capital of his world empire. He ordered the reconstruction of temples that had fallen into disrepair, initiated repairs to irrigation systems, and envisioned transforming Babylon into a synthesis of Greek and Oriental civilization. Yet destiny had other plans. In June 323 BCE, at the age of 32, Alexander fell ill in Nebuchadnezzar's palace and died there within days, his body lying in state in the very halls where Babylon's greatest king had once ruled. Alexander's death in Babylon marked a turning point in the city's fortunes. His empire fragmented among his generals, and Babylon found itself caught in endless wars between the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids who controlled Mesopotamia. The Seleucid kings, though they initially honored Babylon, eventually founded a new capital at Seleucia on the Tigris. This new city drew away population, commerce, and administrative functions. Babylon began a long, slow decline that would stretch across centuries. The cuneiform tablets from Babylon's final centuries preserve a poignant record of this gradual abandonment. Astronomical diaries, those meticulous records that Babylonian priests had maintained for generations, continue into the 1st century CE, documenting celestial observations with the same precision their predecessors had used 1,000 years earlier. Business documents record transactions in a city of diminishing importance. Temple records note festivals celebrated with dwindling participation. Then gradually, the texts cease. The last dated cuneiform tablet from Babylon was written in 75 CE, nearly 600 years after Cyrus's conquest. With that final tablet, the written tradition that had begun with the Sumerians 3 millennia earlier finally ended. By the time of Christ's birth, Babylon existed more as legend than reality. Greek and Roman writers described it as a wonder of the ancient world, but their accounts mixed fact with fantasy, preserving memories of the hanging gardens, the massive walls, and the Tower of Babel while often confusing details or embellishing realities. The city that remained was a shadow, some structures still inhabited, but the great palaces crumbling, the temples abandoned, the walls breached and unrepaired, the irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture silting up without maintenance. The desert, patient as always, began to reclaim what humanity had built. Sand drifted through the streets where Nebuchadnezzar's processions had once marched. The Ishtar Gate, stripped of its glazed bricks by later builders seeking materials, stood as a skeleton of its former glory. The ziggurat of Etemenanki, that Tower of Babel which had reached toward heaven, eroded under wind and rain, its mud bricks dissolving back into the earth from which they had been formed. The Euphrates shifted its course, as Mesopotamian rivers often did, abandoning the channel that had sustained Babylon for millennia. By the medieval period, Babylon had become a field of ruins used by local inhabitants as a quarry for building materials. The magnificent palaces that Nebuchadnezzar had built became sources of fired brick for construction projects throughout the region. The site that had once held the world's greatest city was reduced to mounds of earth covering buried walls, fragments of pottery, and occasionally mysterious cuneiform tablets that no one could read. Even the location of ancient Babylon became uncertain, remembered in Arab tradition but not precisely identified. Then, in the 19th century, European archaeologists turned their attention to Mesopotamia, driven by biblical accounts and classical descriptions of cities that seemed almost mythical. In 1899, German archaeologist Robert Koldewey began systematic excavations at Babylon. What his team uncovered over the following decades astonished the world. The Ishtar Gate emerged from the earth, its blue glazed bricks still brilliant after 24 centuries. The processional way revealed itself, lions still striding across its walls. The foundations of Nebuchadnezzar's palaces exposed the scale of his building projects. The ziggurat's base, though the upper stages had dissolved, showed the massive footprint of the structure that had inspired the Tower of Babel legend. Koldewey's excavations, and those that followed, revealed not merely a city but the material evidence of a civilization's achievements. Here were the administrative tablets that showed how Nebuchadnezzar managed his empire. Here were the ration lists that documented the support given to Jehoiakim, the captive Jewish king, confirming biblical accounts. Here were astronomical texts that demonstrated Babylonian science had been far more sophisticated than previously imagined. Here were literary works, mathematical tables, legal documents, and royal inscriptions that transformed Babylon from legend into history. Yet what the excavations revealed was equally what Babylon had given to all subsequent civilizations. The city's influence extended far beyond its political existence. Hammurabi's code, with its principle of proportional justice and its insistence that law should be written and public, influenced legal thinking throughout the ancient Near East and ultimately shaped Western legal traditions. The astronomical observations accumulated by Babylonian priests over centuries provided data that Greek astronomers would use to develop more sophisticated models of celestial mechanics. Babylonian mathematics, with its place-value number system and sophisticated algebraic techniques, influenced Greek mathematics and, through them, European science. The architectural legacy proved equally profound. The ziggurat form influenced religious architecture across Mesopotamia and beyond. The use of glazed bricks for decorative purposes perfected in Babylon spread throughout the ancient world. Urban planning concepts developed in Babylon, the integration of temples, palaces, and residential areas, the construction of monumental gates and processional ways, the creation of defensive systems combining multiple walls influenced city design for centuries. Perhaps most significantly, Babylon's cultural and ideological influence shaped how subsequent civilizations understood empire itself. The concept of a universal empire with a divine mandate, the ideology that later Persian, Greek, and Roman empires would adopt, was in many ways a Babylonian invention. The idea that a city could be not merely a political capital, but a sacred center. That kingship involved not just military power, but religious and cultural authority. That empire required not just conquest, but administrative sophistication and cultural prestige. These concepts, fully developed in Babylon, became fundamental to how later civilizations organized themselves. In religious history, Babylon's impact was equally profound, though often as a negative example. For the Jewish people, the Babylonian exile became a defining experience, shaping theological understanding and religious practice in ways that influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The destruction of Solomon's temple and the exile to Babylon created a crisis that forced Jewish thinkers to reimagine their relationship with God, to develop practices that could sustain identity without temple or homeland, to create texts that could preserve tradition across generations and geography. The Hebrew Bible, as we know it, was largely compiled and edited during and after the Babylonian exile. For Christians, Babylon became a powerful symbol in the Book of Revelation, representing worldly power opposed to divine purposes, luxury and corruption in contrast to heavenly purity. This symbolic Babylon, while having little to do with the historical city, kept the name alive in Western consciousness long after the actual city had been forgotten. For Muslims, Babylon appears in traditions as a place of ancient knowledge and mysterious power, where angels taught magic and where the ancient sciences were preserved. Even in its ruin, even in its absence, Babylon continued to fascinate. The Hanging Gardens, though perhaps legendary, became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a symbol of human ability to create paradise on earth. The Tower of Babel, based on Etemenanke, became Western civilization's archetypal story about human ambition, divine judgment, and the origin of linguistic diversity. Babylon entered language itself as a byword for both magnificent achievement and moral corruption, for the heights of civilization and the depths of decadence. In the 20th century, Babylon experienced one final tragic chapter. Saddam Hussein, styling himself a new Nebuchadnezzar, initiated reconstruction projects at the ancient site, building a palace on top of archaeological remains and stamping bricks with inscriptions comparing himself to Babylon's ancient king. These projects, carried out without proper archaeological oversight, damaged irreplaceable remains. Then came the Iraq War, and the ancient site became a military base with helicopters landing on archaeological areas and soldiers filling sandbags with artifact-bearing earth. The damage done to Babylon in these years perhaps exceeded that of any period since the city's ancient abandonment. Yet even this could not destroy what Babylon truly was. The essence of Babylon lies not in the ruins on the Euphrates, but in the human imagination, in our continuing fascination with a city that represented the pinnacle of ancient achievement. Babylon lives in every law code that proclaims justice for the powerless, in every astronomical observation that seeks to understand the cosmos, in every monumental building designed to inspire awe, in every empire that claims divine sanction, in every exile who maintains identity far from home. There is something eternal about the story of Babylon, something that transcends the rise and fall of dynasties, that survives the dissolution of brick walls and the silence of abandoned temples. It is the story of human ambition pushed to its limits, of civilization at its most magnificent and most terrifying, of the eternal tension between human achievement and human hubris, between building toward heaven and the inevitable return to dust. When we walk through museums and see the blue glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate, when we read Hammurabi's code and recognize principles still embedded in our legal systems, when we study Babylonian astronomical texts and see the observations that enabled accurate predictions of eclipses, when we encounter the word Babel, meaning confused speech, or Babylon, meaning powerful corruption, we are touching something that connects us across 4,000 years to the people who walked those ancient streets, who built those massive walls, who believed their city would last forever. They were wrong about forever, as all empires are. The walls fell, the temples crumbled, the language died, the people dispersed. Yet they were also right in ways they could not have imagined. Babylon does live forever, not as a political entity, not as a physical place, but as an idea, an inspiration, a warning, a dream. It lives as humanity's first great experiment in urban civilization, as the city that showed what human beings could achieve when they combined ambition with organization, when they harnessed the resources of empire to create monuments that would outlast their creators, and so Babylon endures. Eternal not in stone but in memory, immortal not through conquest but through influence, forever present in the foundations of every civilization that came after, in the laws we write and the cities we build and the empires we dream of and the warnings we tell ourselves about pride and power and the inevitable fall that follows the highest rise. The city that once proclaimed itself the gate of the gods, the navel of the world, the eternal dwelling place of divinity, achieved a kind of immortality that its kings never imagined. It became not merely a place but an idea, Not merely a capital, but a symbol, not merely history, but legend. And in that transformation, Babylon truly did become eternal.